What if the world as you know it was built on a mistake? A geographical miscalculation that led to the greatest collision of cultures in human history. This is the story of how two halves of the world, separated for millennia, were violently brought together. It's a story of ambition, greed, and unimaginable courage. But it's also a story of disease destruction and a demographic catastrophe without precedent. This is the story of how the Americas were colonized and how that single event forged the very foundations of our modern world. To understand the conquest, we must first forget the myth of an empty, untamed wilderness. The Americas of the year 1492 were a world teeming with millions of people, thousands of cultures, and hundreds of languages. In the heart of modern-day Mexico, the mighty Aztec Empire ruled by the Mexica people dominated the region. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, was an architectural marvel. It was a city of over 200,000 people built on an island in the middle of a lake. With its towering pyramids, immaculate causeways, and floating gardens, it was larger, cleaner, and more magnificent than any city in Europe at the time. The society was built on a complex understanding of agriculture, astronomy, and warfare. Their markets buzzed with trade, and their temples were sites of elaborate ceremony. They had created a vibrant civilization, rich with art, poetry, and philosophy. It was a world built on its own terms, with a history stretching back for centuries, completely isolated from the continents across the great oceans. Further south, stretching along the spine of the Andes Mountains, was the Inca Empire. This was a masterpiece of engineering and administration. It was connected by a road system spanning over 25,000 miles, a network that rivaled that of the Roman Empire. They had no traditional written language, yet they managed a complex society of millions. Their administrators used an ingenious system of knotted cords called the quipu to keep detailed records of populations, goods, and taxes. Their stone masonry was so precise that they could build massive structures without mortar, fitting huge stones together like pieces of a puzzle. Their agricultural terraces carved into steep mountainsides are still marveled at today. The Inca ruled a diverse empire with a centralized government and a powerful army. Their emperor, known as the Sapa Inca, was considered a living god, a direct descendant of the sun god Inti. This divine authority was the glue that held their vast and rugged territory together. Beyond these great empires, the continents were a mosaic of societies. In North America, the Mississippian people built Cahokia, a sprawling city of mounds near modern-day St. Louis. At its peak around the year 1100, Cahokia was the largest city north of Mexico, with a population that rivaled London's at the time. Its Great Monk's Mound, a massive earthen structure, was larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. In the eastern woodlands, the tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy formed a sophisticated political alliance, a participatory democracy that would later inspire some of America's founding fathers. In the Amazon rainforest, countless communities thrived, developing unique relationships with one of the most biodiverse environments on Earth. This was a world alive with innovation and history. It was a world completely unaware of the storm gathering across the ocean. That storm was brewing in a Europe on the edge of transformation. For centuries, Europe had been a relative backwater. It was dependent on the East for luxury goods like spices and silk, which trickled in through long and dangerous trade routes. But in the year 1453, a pivotal event changed everything. The powerful Ottoman Empire captured the city of Constantinople, the gateway to the East. This move effectively severed the overland trade routes for Christian Europe. Suddenly, the monarchies of Western Europe, particularly Spain and Portugal, grew desperate for a new path to the riches of Asia. Their economies and the tastes of their nobility depended on it. This desperation was fueled by a potent combination of motives. The first was gold. The promise of unimaginable wealth drove explorers and their royal backers. The second was glory. Personal fame and national prestige were powerful incentives for the ambitious men of the Renaissance. The third was God. A deep-seated religious fervor after centuries of crusades created a powerful desire to spread Christianity across the globe. This trio of goals, gold, glory, and God, became the driving force of the age of exploration. New technologies made these ambitions seem possible for the first time. The caravel, a small, fast, and maneuverable ship, could sail against the wind. The astrolabe and the magnetic compass allowed sailors to navigate with greater accuracy on the open ocean. All they needed was a captain bold or perhaps foolish enough to sail west into the unknown to find the East. That captain was an Italian navigator from Genoa with a radical idea. His name was Christopher Columbus. After a grueling 2-month voyage, his 3 small ships, having pushed the limits of his crew's endurance, land was spotted on October 12, 1492. Columbus and his men had made it, but he was not in the East Indies as he believed. He was in the Bahamas, in a world entirely new to Europeans. The people he met there, the peaceful Taino people he called Indians. This was a geographical mistake that would stick for centuries, creating a false unified identity for thousands of distinct cultures. His first impression, recorded in his own journal, was telling of his intentions. He wrote that they do not bear arms and do not know them. He observed that they would make fine servants. He concluded that with 50 men they could subjugate them all and make them do whatever they want. It was a chilling prophecy of what was to come in the decades ahead. Columbus's voyage opened the floodgates to the Americas. Following him came the conquistadors. These were soldiers of fortune, men hardened by centuries of warfare in Spain during the Reconquista. They were now seeking wealth and fame in this proclaimed New World. 2 of their stories would become legendary tales of conquest against impossible odds. In the year 1519, a Spanish conquistador named Hernán Cortés landed on the coast of Mexico. He had with him just 500 men, 13 horses, and a few cannons. His target was the colossal Aztec Empire, an empire of millions. How could such a tiny force even dream of challenging such a powerful civilization? The answer was not just their superior steel swords, armor, and firearms. It was a brilliant and brutal strategy of cunning betrayal and an invisible, terrifying ally. Cortés expertly exploited the political divisions within the Aztec Empire. He forged critical alliances with local tribes who hated their Aztec overlords and were forced to pay them tribute. He marched on the capital, Tenochtitlan, and was initially welcomed by the Emperor Moctezuma II. Moctezuma may have believed that Cortés was a returning god from an ancient prophecy. This hesitation proved fatal. Cortés took Moctezuma hostage within his own palace, sparking outrage in the city. The situation exploded into violence. The Spanish were driven from the city in a bloody retreat known as La Noche Triste, or the Sad Night. Many of his men were lost, but the conquistadors had left behind a secret weapon. It was a biological agent far deadlier than any cannon. It was the smallpox virus. The disease, common and often non-lethal to Europeans, was completely alien to the immune systems of the Americas. It ripped through the population with terrifying speed. The plague killed a third or more of the people in the region, including the new Aztec emperor. With the city weakened by this devastating plague and its leadership in chaos, Cortés returned. He besieged the great city of Tenochtitlan for months, cutting off food and water. Finally, in August of the year 1521, the magnificent capital of the Aztec Empire fell. It was razed to the ground, and on its ruins, Mexico City would be built. A decade later, history would repeat itself, this time with even more audacity and cruelty. In the year 1532, another conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, marched with fewer than 200 men into the heart of the mighty Inca Empire. This civilization was then home to 10 million people. The empire, however, was already weakened. It was reeling from a brutal civil war between 2 brothers vying for the throne. The first whispers of the same smallpox epidemic that had doomed the Aztecs had also begun to spread south, causing death and instability. Pizarro invited the victorious Inca Emperor Atahualpa to a meeting in the town of Cajamarca. Atahualpa arrived with thousands of unarmed attendants, a show of supreme confidence in divine power. It was a fatal miscalculation. Pizarro's men sprang a trap from the surrounding buildings. They used their cannons and cavalry to create chaos, slaughtering the shocked and unarmed attendants. They captured the emperor himself. Atahualpa, the living god of the Incas, was now a prisoner. He offered a legendary ransom to secure his freedom. He promised to fill a large room once with gold and twice with silver. The Spanish eagerly agreed. For months, treasure poured in from across the empire. Priceless works of Incan art were melted down into bullion. Once the ransom was paid, the Spanish executed him anyway. Without its divine leader, the Inca Empire, for all its power and organization, quickly crumbled into chaos, allowing Pizarro to march on and capture the capital of Cusco. The conquest of 2 of the world's greatest empires was complete. The conquest was swift and brutal. The colonization that followed was a slow, grinding process of remaking the continents in Europe's image. Each colonial power had its own model for exploitation and control. For Spain, the primary goal was the extraction of mineral wealth. They established a system called the encomienda. This system granted Spanish colonists land and the right to use native people as forced labor in mines and on farms. It was slavery in all but name. In places like Potosí in modern-day Bolivia, entire mountains were hollowed out for their silver. This silver flooded into Spain, making it the richest nation on earth for a time. It funded Spain's European wars and forever altered the global economy. The Spanish also imposed a rigid social caste system. Spanish-born peninsulares were at the top, followed by Creoles born in the Americas. At the bottom were the indigenous and African peoples, whose labor fueled the entire system. In Brazil, the Portuguese found their wealth not in silver, but in sugar. This commodity was known as white gold for its immense profitability. Sugar cultivation is incredibly labor-intensive, requiring a large workforce for the grueling work of planting, harvesting, and processing cane. The Portuguese first enslaved the local Tupi people, but they were decimated by European diseases and resisted fiercely, often escaping into the vast interior of the continent. To feed the insatiable appetite of their sugar mills, the Portuguese turned to another continent, Africa. This decision ignited the transatlantic slave trade on an industrial scale. It created a system of human trafficking that would become one of the darkest chapters in world history, bringing millions of Africans to the Americas in chains. Further north in North America, the English, French, and Dutch arrived later. They came with different ambitions. The French were primarily focused on the lucrative fur trade. This business model often led them to form alliances and even intermarry with native tribes, creating unique cultural bonds. The English came seeking not just wealth, but land to settle permanently. From the tobacco plantations of Virginia, which would soon also turn to African slave labor, to the religious colonies of New England, their goal was to build a New England. Their approach often led to conflict and warfare, as their expanding settlements pushed native peoples further and further west from their ancestral lands. While the Spanish model was one of conquest and forced assimilation, the English model became one of settlement and displacement. The colonization of the Americas did not just change the Americas. It changed the entire world in ways that are still felt today. This vast process of transfer is now known as the Columbian Exchange. It was the greatest transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and ideas between the old and new worlds. From the Americas, the world received foods that would trigger population booms across the globe. The humble potato, easy to grow and calorie-rich, revolutionized the diet of the European working class. It helped end centuries of famine. Corn became a staple food in Africa and Asia. The Italian food we love today is unimaginable without the American tomato. Chocolate and vanilla became global luxuries. In return, Europe, Africa, and Asia brought their own plants and animals to the Americas. Wheat, coffee, and sugarcane would create new plantation economies, often with devastating social consequences. But the most transformative arrivals were the animals. Pigs, cattle, and sheep altered the American landscape forever. And one animal in particular would change everything for many native cultures. The horse was reintroduced to the Americas by the Spanish. These animals spread across the continent, transforming the cultures of Great Plains tribes like the Lakota and Comanche, turning them into legendary nomadic hunters and warriors. But the exchange was not equal or benign. The most devastating item transferred was disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza flowed almost entirely in one direction from east to west. This resulted in the Great Dying. It was the single greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. It is estimated that as much as 90% of the indigenous population perished in the century following contact. This immense loss of life is what truly made the European conquest possible. To replace that lost labor force, the triangular trade was born and perfected. European ships carried manufactured goods to Africa. They traded these goods for enslaved people. They then transported those people across the horrific Middle Passage to the Americas in unimaginably brutal conditions. The ships then returned to Europe carrying the sugar, cotton, and tobacco that the enslaved were forced to produce. Over 12 million Africans were stolen from their homes and families in this brutal system. It was a crime against humanity whose legacy of racism and inequality echoes to this very day in societies across the Americas. 500 years later, The world born from that geographical miscalculation is the one we all inhabit. The borders of the countries on our maps, the languages we speak, the religions we practice, and the globalized economy we depend on are all direct consequences of this era. The colonization of the Americas created immense wealth and built new nations, but it was accomplished at an unimaginable human cost. It was an event that connected the world like never before, but it did so through threads of exploitation and violence. To understand this complex, brutal, and transformative past is not about assigning blame. It is about understanding the present. It is the key to understanding the forces that continue to shape our world, from the lingering inequalities in our societies to the rich hybrid cultures that define the Americas today. The story of the colonization of the Americas is not just their history, it is the history of us all.